You are standing in a field of wild grass. It is roughly 14,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now northeastern Jordan. The air is dry, the sun is brutal, and the plants around you look like nothing you would eat. Thin, papery seeds clinging to the top of brittle stalks, hard as pebbles, bitter. If you bit into one raw, you would crack a tooth and spit it out. Wait, there is no reason, no obvious reason, to look at this plant and think food. And yet the people standing next to you are harvesting it. They are cutting the seed heads off with flint blades and collecting them in animal skin bags. Then they haul them back to camp, where someone will spend the next several hours cracking, pounding, grinding, and burning these tiny, tasteless grains into something edible. Not because it is easy, because it is one of the hardest things they will do all week. But that sequence, that painful, tedious, multi-step transformation of an inedible seed into something a human body can actually use, is the quiet beginning of the single most important food humans have ever made. So how did we figure out bread? The answer is older than farming, older than pottery, older than civilization, and it might be the reason civilization exists at all. Let us start with the part that most people get wrong, because almost everyone assumes the same thing. We settled down, we planted crops, and then we figured out how to make bread. That is the story most of us learned. It is also, according to the last 2 decades of archaeological evidence, probably backwards. In 2018, archaeobotanist Amaya Arendsotegui at the University of Copenhagen published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that changed the timeline. Her team had been excavating a site called Shubeika 1, a Natufian hunter-gatherer camp in the Black Desert of Jordan between 2012 and 2015. In the remains of 2 stone-lined fireplaces, they found 24 charred food fragments. Under a scanning electron microscope, those fragments revealed something nobody expected. They were bread, flatbread, made from wild einkorn, barley, oats, and the ground tubers of an aquatic plant called club rush. The date was roughly 1,400 years ago. 4,000 years before anyone on Earth planted a single deliberate seed. Think about that. Hunter-gatherers, people with no farms, no fields, no storage silos, no permanent homes, were making bread, and not accidentally. The process required harvesting wild grains, dehusking them, grinding them into flour on stone surfaces, mixing the flour with water, and baking the dough in the ashes of a fire. That is at least 5 separate steps, each requiring its own knowledge and its own tools. Nobody stumbles into that sequence. That is a recipe. And it was being followed by people who, according to the old narrative, were not supposed to know how to do any of it. But Shubeika 1 is not even the oldest evidence of flour. At a site called Ohalo 2 on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel, archaeologists made another discovery. Ehud Weiss of Bar Ilan University found a large, flat grinding stone with starch residues embedded in its surface. The starch came from wild wheat, barley, and oats. The site is roughly 23,000 years old. 23,000. That is the late Ice Age. Mammoths still walked the earth, and someone on the edge of a lake was grinding wild grain into flour. Whether they baked it into bread or ate it as a paste or porridge, they had already figured out the critical first step. Take a hard, indigestible seed and turn it into something soft enough to eat. And the grinding goes back even further. At Grotta Paglici in southern Italy, researchers found a pestle grinder in a layer dated to roughly 326 years ago. It contained starch grains from wild oats that had been thermally pre-treated, meaning heated before grinding. Similar tools from the same era have turned up at Bilancino 2 in Italy, Kostenki 16 in Russia, and Pavlov 6 in the Czech Republic. 30,000 years ago, across a wide swath of Ice Age Europe, humans were already processing wild grains. Now here's the connection to bread that matters. Every one of these early grain processors was solving the same problem, and it is a problem that leads directly to why bread exists at all. Raw grain is nearly useless to a human body. The seeds of wild grasses are wrapped in a tough, fibrous husk. The starch inside is locked in a crystalline structure your gut cannot break down efficiently. If you eat raw grain, you get very little energy out of it. You might as well chew on wood. But if you crack the husk, grind the starch into a fine powder, and then apply heat, something changes. The heat gelatinizes the starch, unfolding those crystalline structures and turning them into a form your digestive system can actually absorb. The calories become available. The energy becomes real. Grinding and cooking grain is not just food preparation, it is a chemical hack. It unlocks energy that was always in the seed, but that your body could never reach without intervention. And here's the thing about the human gut that most people never think about. Compared to other great apes, our digestive tract is small. A chimpanzee has a much larger colon relative to body size. We traded gut size for brain size, which is a terrible deal if you are eating raw plants. Because raw plants take forever to digest and yield limited calories. Cooking solved that problem for meat and tubers, but grain is different. Grain is a seed designed to pass through the digestive system of an animal intact, so it can germinate somewhere else. That is literally the evolutionary purpose of the seed coat. It is armor. Grinding cracks that armor. Heat breaks down the starch inside. And fermentation, which comes later in the bread story, goes even further, reducing anti-nutrients like phytic acid by 50 to 70%, making iron, zinc, and magnesium suddenly available to the body. Your gut did not evolve to eat grain. Bread is the technology that made grain edible anyway. Some gut bacteria, like Bacteroides, the Tyotea omicron, even genetically adapted to digest compounds found specifically in bread and yeast used by brewers. Your body literally reshaped itself around this food. And bread, flat or otherwise, is the most efficient delivery system anyone ever invented for that energy. You mix ground flour with water, you form a dough. You put it on a hot stone or in ashes. In minutes, you have a portable, storable, calorie-dense food that weighs almost nothing and lasts for days. Compare that to carrying raw meat, which rots. Or fruit, which bruises, or tubers, which are bulky and heavy. Bread is lightweight fuel. And for a species that spent most of its existence walking from one food source to the next, lightweight fuel is survival. So here is the question that has been haunting archaeologists for the last 10 years. If bread came before farming, did bread cause farming? The traditional story says agriculture led to bread. But the evidence increasingly points the other direction. Making bread from wild grains is brutally labor-intensive. You have to find the grain, harvest it by hand, stalk by stalk, carry it back to camp. Dehusk every individual seed, grind it on a stone for hours, mix and bake it. The yield is low and the effort is enormous. But the product, bread, is extraordinary. It is dense, storable, portable energy, and there is growing evidence that it was a prestige food, something served at feasts, at gatherings, at rituals, not something you ate every Tuesday. This is where Göbekli Tepe enters the story. That massive ritual complex in southeastern Turkey, built by hunter-gatherers around 9500 BC. Thousands of years before anyone in the region was farming, shows evidence of large-scale cereal processing. Researchers believe enormous quantities of grain were brought to the site to feed the workers and worshippers who gathered there. The theory was supported by archaeologists like Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavation. The need to produce enough grain for these communal events, and the desire for a reliable supply of bread and beer for feasts, may have created social pressure. That pressure may have pushed people to start deliberately planting seeds. Bread did not follow farming. Bread, and the hunger for it, may have driven farming into existence. Think about that for a second. The entire agricultural revolution was the single most consequential shift in human history. It led to cities, empires, writing, and the world you are sitting in right now. And it may have started because people wanted a more reliable supply of bread. And speaking of the grains themselves, the wild ancestors of wheat look nothing like what you see on a farm today. Wild einkorn has a brittle stem that shatters when the seeds are ripe, scattering them on the ground, which is great for the plant, but terrible for a human trying to collect them. Genetic and archaeological research points to the Karkadag Mountains in southeastern Turkey as the region where einkorn wheat was first domesticated from its wild ancestor, sometime around 8500 to 8000 BC. What early farmers did, probably without fully understanding it, was select for plants whose stems did not shatter. They picked the ones that were easier to harvest, replanted those seeds, and slowly, over generations, turned a wild grass into a crop. Emmer wheat and barley were domesticated across a broader arc of the Fertile Crescent, from modern Turkey through Syria, down into Israel and Jordan. Every grain we use today descends from those early experiments. Now, here is where bread takes a turn that nobody saw coming, because at some point, someone left their dough out too long, and instead of throwing it away, they baked it anyway. And it puffed up. That is leavened bread! And the best evidence suggests it was invented in ancient Egypt, probably by accident, when wild yeast spores from the air settled on a batch of dough and began to ferment. The chemistry is simple. Flour contains two proteins called glutenin and gliadin. When you add water and work the mixture, those proteins unfold and bond together into an elastic network called gluten. Gluten is stretchy. It forms tiny pockets. And when yeast, specifically Saccharomyces cerevisiae, begins eating the sugars in the dough and producing carbon dioxide gas, those gluten pockets trap the gas. The dough inflates. It rises. And when you bake it, the heat kills the yeast, evaporates the alcohol, and sets the protein structure permanently. What you get is soft, airy bread, the kind you actually want to eat. The Egyptians did not just stumble onto this, they mastered it. By the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 1570 to 1070 BC, Egypt had cataloged nearly 40 distinct types of bread, flavored with dates, figs, coriander, and honey. They baked in conical ceramic molds called bedja by the hundreds of thousands. Bread was so central to Egyptian life that it was currency. Workers who built the pyramids at Giza were paid in rations of bread and beer, not coins, not gold. Bread, the pharaoh was, in a very real sense, the chief baker of the kingdom. His legitimacy depended on his ability to feed people, and feeding people meant bread. And here is a detail that connects bread and beer in a way most people do not expect. They are the same invention. Both start with grain, both require grinding, both require water and fermentation in many ancient Egyptian facilities. Bread and beer were produced side by side using the same raw materials. A common brewing technique involved baking coarse loaves of bread, crumbling them into water, and letting the mixture ferment. The bread was the yeast starter for the beer. And yeast foam skimmed from beer was used to leaven bread. They were a single, circular system. Anthropologists still argue about which came first, the bread or the beer, and whether the real incentive for domesticating grain was calories or alcohol. The honest answer is probably both, and the two are so intertwined that separating them is like asking which came first, the inhale or the exhale. In 2019, a physicist named Seamus Blackley, who also happens to be the co-creator of the Xbox, partnered with archaeologist Serena Love and microbiologist Richard Bowman on an experiment that sounds like science fiction. They extracted dormant yeast from 4,500-year-old Egyptian ceramic baking vessels held at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Peabody Museum at Harvard. Using a non-invasive syringe technique, they pulled samples from the porous clay. They fed the revived organisms ancient emmer wheat flour. And then they baked with it. Blackley described the resulting loaf as having a rich, sour aroma and a sweetness like brown sugar. Whether the yeast was truly ancient or environmental contamination is debated, but the experiment put a 4,500-year-old recipe in modern hands. Now, there is something about ancient bread making that most histories leave out, and it matters. The physical cost, grinding grain by hand, is brutal. A saddle quern, the simplest grinding technology, is just a large flat stone and a smaller handstone. You kneel on the ground, push the handstone back and forth across the grain, hour after hour, until the seeds break down into flour. Bioarchaeological studies of women from early agricultural communities have revealed what this did to their bodies. At the site of Abu Huraira in Syria, skeletal remains showed severe arthritis in the big toes from curling them forward while kneeling for hours, collapsed vertebrae in the lower back. Arm bones so dense from the repetitive grinding motion that they rival the bones of modern elite rowers. The bread that fed early civilizations was ground, overwhelmingly, by women. And the evidence is in their skeletons. Their arms are remodeled. Their spines are damaged. The bread was not free. Someone paid for every loaf with their body. That physical toll is one of the reasons the invention of the rotary quern, sometime around the 5th or 4th century BC, was such a significant change. Instead of pushing a stone back and forth, you spun it. The motion was more efficient, the flour was finer, and the labor, while still hard, was less destructive. The Romans took this further. At the Barbegal complex in southern France, built in the 2nd century AD, 16 overshot water wheels powered a flour mill that produced an estimated 4.5 tons of flour per day. Water did the grinding. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, bread did not require a human body to break, and the Romans treated bread as a political instrument. The poet Juvenal coined the phrase "Panem et circenses," bread and circuses, describing how Roman leaders maintained power by keeping the urban masses fed and entertained. Free grain distributions to citizens of Rome began in 123 BC under Gaius Gracchus and expanded over the centuries. By the height of the empire, roughly 2,000 Romans received free grain every month. The bakers who turned that grain into bread, the pastores, were organized into the Collegium Pistorum, one of the most heavily regulated guilds in the city. If you were a baker in Rome, you could not leave the profession. Your children inherited the obligation. Bread was too important to leave to the free market. And there is one Roman baker whose ambition outlasted every emperor. Marcus Virgilius Eurysaces was a freedman, a former slave who made his fortune baking bread. When he died around 30 BC, his family built him a tomb near the Porta Maggiore in Rome that still stands today. It is massive. Decorated with stone carvings of kneading basins and friezes showing every stage of industrial bread production, a freed slave built himself a monument to bread that has survived for over 2,000 years. That tells you everything about what bread meant in the ancient world, and if you want to see what a Roman bakery actually looked like, go to Pompeii. When Vesuvius buried the city in 79 AD, it preserved over 30 commercial bakeries in volcanic ash. Complete with their brick-arched ovens, their hourglass-shaped stone mills turned by donkeys, and in some cases, the bread itself. Archaeologists found a round loaf called panis quadratus, pre-scored into 8 wedges so you could tear it apart with your hands. It was still sitting in an oven. 19 centuries later, you can see the exact shape of the bread a Roman was about to eat on the morning a volcano ended everything. Pompeii had a population of roughly 11,000 people and over 30 bakeries. That is one bakery for every 350 people. For reference, modern New York City has roughly one bakery for every 1,200 people. Roman Pompeii had proportionally more bakeries than Manhattan. Bread was not a side dish. It was the main course of an entire civilization. Now, bread is not one invention, it is dozens. Because almost every culture on Earth independently looked at whatever starchy plant grew nearby and figured out how to grind it, mix it with water, and cook it flat. Corn tortillas in Mesoamerica. Injera from teff in Ethiopia, naan and chapati from wheat in South Asia. Baked in clay tandoor ovens. Pita in the Middle East, lavash across the Caucasus. Arepas from maize in South America. Roti across a dozen countries. None of these cultures were in contact with each other when they developed their flatbreads. They arrived at the same solution independently because the problem is universal. You have a starchy plant. Your body cannot digest it raw. Grind it, add water, apply heat. The physics and the biology are the same everywhere. Bread is a convergent invention, the same way the eye evolved independently in dozens of separate lineages. Wherever humans and grain coexist, bread follows, and the language itself remembers. The English word companion comes from the Latin com, meaning with, and panis, meaning bread. A companion is someone you share bread with. The word lord comes from Old English hlafweird, meaning loaf guardian, the person who protects and distributes the bread. Lady comes from hlafdige, meaning loaf kneader, the person who makes it. When English speakers say lord and lady, they are using words that are, at their root, about bread. The language has been carrying the importance of bread inside itself for over 1,000 years, and most people have no idea. Bread shaped religion too. In Judaism, matzah, unleavened flatbread, is eaten during Passover as a reminder of the hasty departure from Egypt, bread baked without time for it to rise. Challah represents the double portion of manna that sustained the Israelites. In Christianity, bread became the body of Christ in the Eucharist, the most sacred ritual in the faith. Jesus called himself the bread of life, Nasis. In Islam, bread is treated with such reverence that dropping it on the ground is followed by picking it up and kissing it. Bread is not food in these traditions. It is the symbol through which the sacred enters the everyday, and bread toppled governments. In 18th century France, workers spent up to 88% of their wages on bread. 88%. When harvests failed in 1788 and 1789 and bread prices spiked, the result was not a policy discussion, it was a revolution. The March on Versailles, led by women in October 1789, was driven in large part by the price of bread. The king was called the first baker of the kingdom, and when he could not bake, he could not rule. The phrase attributed to Marie Antoinette, "let them eat cake," almost certainly was never said by her. It comes from the Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, written when she was still a child. But the fact that the myth survived tells you how completely bread was intertwined with political legitimacy. When people cannot afford bread, they overthrow the people responsible. And there is one more thread that ties bread to the foundation of civilization itself. Writing. The first writing system in human history, Sumerian cuneiform, did not develop to record poetry or mythology. It developed to count grain. Around 8000 BC, administrators in Mesopotamia began using small clay tokens shaped to represent specific quantities of barley. Over centuries, those tokens were pressed into wet clay tablets, leaving impressions that evolved into abstract wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform, the invention that separates prehistory from history, exists because someone needed to keep track of how much grain had been collected, stored, and redistributed. The written word was born in a grain warehouse. And grain meant bread. In medieval Europe, bread was a marker of class. The nobility ate white manchet loaves made from finely sifted wheat flour. The poor ate dark, coarse bread made from rye, oats, or whatever was available. In times of famine, people ground acorns and peas into flour. The assize of bread and ale, passed in England in 1266, legally regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread to prevent bakers from cheating their customers. Bread was too important to be unregulated. It was too dangerous to get wrong, and then the modern era industrialized it. Bees. On July 7th, 1928, the Chillicothe Baking Company in Missouri sold the first commercially sliced bread. It used a machine invented by Otto Frederick Rohvetter after a decade of setbacks that included a fire which destroyed his prototypes. In 1961, the British Baking Industries Research Association in Chorleywood, England, developed the Chorleywood bread process, replacing traditional long fermentation with high-speed mechanical mixing, extra yeast, emulsifiers, and dough conditioners. The process was fast, consistent, and cheap. It transformed bread from a craft into a manufactured product. Today, the Chorleywood process produces the majority of commercially sold bread in Britain and much of the world. A loaf that took ancient bakers an entire day of grinding, mixing, and waiting now rolls off a production line in under 3 hours. So, the answer: how did humans invent bread? They did not. Not in one place, not in one moment. Not as a single idea. Bread was invented dozens of times. Independently. Across thousands of years. On every inhabited continent. By people who had never heard of each other, using whatever grain or starchy plant grew near them. The process always followed the same sequence because the chemistry demanded it. Harvest, grind, hydrate, heat. Wild einkorn in Jordan 1,400 years ago, wild oats in Italy 32,000 years ago, corn in Mesoamerica. Teff in Ethiopia, rice in East Asia. The problem was universal and the solution was convergent. Was bread a single invention that spread from one source? The probability is essentially zero. The archaeological, botanical, and genetic evidence overwhelmingly supports multiple independent origins across different cultures and time periods. Bread is a convergent technology. The odds that every bread-making culture on Earth learned it from a single source, given the geographic separation, the different base grains, and the wildly different timelines, are negligible, less than 1%. What is near certain, above 95% probability, is that any culture with access to starchy seeds or tubers, grinding tools, water, and fire would eventually arrive at bread. The invention is baked into the physics. But here's the part that stays with me. Bread is just ground seeds, water, and heat. 3 things. That is all it has ever been. And from the simplest possible combination of ingredients, humans built agriculture, cities, empires, religions, tax systems, written language, social hierarchies, political revolutions, and the global economy. All of it traces back to someone kneeling on the ground with a flat rock, crushing a handful of wild seeds into powder, mixing it with water, and pressing it onto a hot stone. They did not know they were inventing civilization. They were just trying to eat. Tomorrow morning, you are probably going to eat bread, toast, maybe a sandwich for lunch, flatbread with dinner. You will not think about the 14,000-year chain of human effort that put it in your hands. You will not think about the woman whose skeleton shows the cost of grinding the flour. You will not think about the hunter-gatherer who figured out that a worthless wild seed, ground fine enough and cooked hot enough, could keep a family alive through winter. You will just eat it. And that, honestly, might be the most human thing about bread. It is so fundamental, so embedded in everything we are, that we forgot it was ever invented at all.